It's indeed a pleasure to welcome back Laura to our forum. She was here in '98 and '99, and it's been a long time, but it's wonderful to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back. So I'm actually here to tell good news, I think. I don't know about your other speakers, but often people on the left have a pretty grim picture of the world. I maintain a dogged commitment to optimism. And this book is really, I say at the beginning, it's a book of good news for grim times. It's not a feel-good book, it's a wise-up book. And it's really a message to all of those people who would tell the Democratic Party to move further to the center and talk more about God and kind of hush those pesky voices at the margins that keep talking about social justice and peace. It's really a book about how progressives can win in this country, and in fact are winning all around the country at the local level, sometimes the state level, and how there are lessons that could be learned by the national Democratic leadership from the people at the base, if only they felt inclined to learn. So that's the nature of the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about where it comes from, and along the way I'm sure I'll get into attacking the media. But really we could all do that, and we all do that all the time. So let me start on the positive stuff. The book really had its birth on election night 2004. I don't know how many of you are Air America listeners or listen to, is it Jack? Uncle Jack? Uncle Jack's niece, Randy Rhoads, on Air America. Yes. So Air America's audience is a very hard-working, hard-hoping, progressive, liberal, democratic audience, right? There's probably no audience out there that more accurately reflected the hopes and dreams of Democratic voters in 2004. And we launched in March of 2004 with great expectations, not enough money, but great expectations. And we were on the air throughout that very exciting election year. And the great thing about call-in radio is you get to hear what your audience are doing, because they call in and tell you. And I heard what people are doing, and they were probably doing what you were doing, which was a whole lot more than they had done for elections any time recently. People were not only giving money and not only giving names from their phone books, they were also knocking on doors in their neighborhoods. They were calling complete strangers out of the blue to ask if they were going to vote. They were even, some of them, traveling to other states and knocking on strangers' doors and asking if they would vote. How many of you did stuff you hadn't done before in 2004, or know people that really got off their butts and did amazing work in that year, right? So more people we know turned out for that election, and maybe they weren't turning out for Kerry Edwards as much as they were turning out to get rid of Bush and Cheney. But they were turning out, they were doing this work. They broke my heart with their excitement. And along the way, I got calls from people saying things like, "Can you get me a Kerry Edwards yard sign?" And I thought, well, I'm in New York. I don't even have a yard, let alone a yard sign. Why the heck are you calling me? I said, why don't you go to the Kerry Edwards website? I'm sure you can download a little sign and hammer it on a piece of wood. So I said this for many weeks until some smart-ass caller called in and said, there is no way to download a sign on the Kerry Edwards website. And then I did what you should never do on talk radio, which was to say, oh, I'm sure there is. And I turned on the computer and I brought up the site, and then you had minutes of dead air while I was going, huh? Because there was almost nothing you could do on the Kerry Edwards website except for sign up to receive pitch letters asking you for money. So that rang a little bell in my head. I was worried. And people said, you know, we can't get anyone to call us back from the Kerry Edwards campaign. We can't get our local Democratic Party office to have office hours. Nobody will contact us when we contact them. There isn't even an office that's open where we live, and the candidates don't come to our state during election year. So I'm thinking about all this, and then election night happens, right? Now, this was supposed to be a cheery day for Democrats, and all day it seemed like it was going to be a cheery day, right? The polls were saying that Kerry Edwards were going to win. I had a whole show prepared that was about how it was all very well for Kerry Edwards to win, but the real work was going to begin when they took office. And as I walked to work, and I live in downtown Manhattan, and although Air America has moved several times, having to do something with not paying bills, we now are at an undisclosed location with Dick Cheney. No. The office on Election Day was in Midtown on 34th Street, and it caused me to walk uptown past Union Square. So I was walking uptown, and I'm sort of addicted to the radio, so I had an earplug in my ear, and I was listening to Al Franken, who for some reason got the cocktail hour shift. And he was reporting live from Kerry Edwards' headquarters in Boston with, I think, a martini in one hand and, the microphone in the other, sounding very happy. And as I walked past Union Square, I thought of, well, not only Emma Goldman and all the history of Union Square, but I thought of the massive demonstrations that had taken place during the Republican National Convention that took place there in Union Square. And I remembered in particular the huge demonstration that took place on the closing night of the Republican National Convention, when, as some of you may remember, the whole of Penn Station, that area where Madison Square Garden is, and where the convention had been taking place, had been completely shut down thanks to Bloomberg. And let's not forget that Michael Bloomberg basically gave our city over to the Republicans, much as he claims to be an independent. The last night of the convention, with all of this security, nonetheless, Cheney and Bush's acceptance speeches were interrupted not once or twice, but 4 times by women from Code Pink and guys from ACT UP, the AIDS organization. And I remembered thinking, a party that is running on national security and can't even keep the borders of its own convention secure from grannies in pink nighties and guys fighting AIDS, I mean, it's got to be over for them, don't you think? Well, as I said, somehow Al Franken got the cocktail shift. I got the graveyard shift. So I was on the air from midnight until 5 in the morning. And this was a little bit less cheery of a time in the day for Democrats than we had seen up to that point. And I describe it sort of as the night of the politically living dead. People had seen one too many of those vote or die posters and were now realizing they were probably going to do both. We actually had so many people call in saying they were going to move to Canada that somebody from Vancouver finally called in and said, "You do know you need a visa to come here." And I spent the evening trying to cheer people up, because that's just me. I thought, oh, these poor people, they've done all this work, they can't be this depressed. I don't want all these good people to move to Canada. Don't move to Canada, I said. And I tried to cheer people up by bringing little glimmers of good news, anything I could think of. And I began to think maybe I was just making it up, but no, I said, look at 2 supposedly red states, those red-blue maps they give us of the Electoral College vote. 2 supposedly red states, Florida and Nevada, had voted to raise the minimum wage against all the odds. These were ballot initiatives that passed in every county of those 2 states, meaning rich, poor, rural, urban, liberal, conservative. That was good news. The governor of Montana, the governorship had gone to a Democrat, Brian Schweitzer, for the first time in 16 years, and power had flipped in the state houses of that state. That was good news. And then I tried to think of a few other things. And I tried to remind the audience that the White House isn't the only thing that makes change in America. That often what actually affects our daily lives isn't what happens far away in Washington, it's what happens right where we live. And I tried to say to them, maybe the change makers that will save you are living on your block, and maybe you should or could join up with them until the next Democrat comes along. Or maybe we need better than a Democrat, because it seems to me that the Democratic Party is not serving its voters very well. You certainly did your best to get Kerry Edwards elected. I know because I heard you. I'm not sure the Democratic Party really did its share of the work. So, and not to mention the votes aren't counted yet, so don't give up. The other thing I thought as I spent that gloomy night on election night, and I don't know how many of you heard me, but it was really quite sad, was I was listening to people calling in from Columbus, Ohio, we were on the air there then, and you know, the pundits and the consultants, Bob Shrum and all the others, were already on the evening CNN headline news talking about the defeat of Kerry Edwards before either of them had conceded the election. And while John Edwards, to his credit, was saying we will not concede until every last vote is counted. And they were blaming the defeat on gay marriage, abortion, and young voters not showing up. And I thought to myself, well, that's rich. Here are two issues that your candidates handled so poorly, and you're going to blame the issues, not the way you handled them? They talk so poorly about a woman's right to choose and so poorly about marriage equality, and you're going to blame us? And then I thought, those young voters, you're going to tell me you're going to blame this election defeat on young voters when your candidates wouldn't speak to any young people's issues? They wouldn't talk about what young people care about, not even once. They wouldn't meet with young people. They wouldn't do an MTV presidential debate this year. They didn't do it in '04. And despite all of that, young voters increased their turnout larger than any other age demographic in the country, and young voters are the only age demographic that votes majority Kerry Edwards, the only age demographic you've got, and you're going to blame them? And I was watching on election night these pundits weigh in, blaming gay people and feminists and the young for not voting or for messing up their result. And I was hearing from young people and feminists and gay and lesbian people who had in many cases been leading the turnout efforts where they lived. And the last person to vote in America was a young man, 21 years old, called Eric Stolfitz, who voted at Kenyon College in Ohio. And he voted at 3:25 in the morning of the 3rd of November. Why? Because he had waited in line 11 and a half hours to vote. And he waited in lines that snaked through his local school and the gymnasium and the college, and people had stood in the rain and they had waited and looked after each other's kids. And I thought, don't you dare blame young people for the defeat of this election, when there are young men like Eric Stolfitz standing 11 and a half hours in the rain to vote. So it was with that spirit that I decided to go out and research whether I was making all this stuff up or living in a dream world, and whether in fact conservatives had taken over this country, or whether Democrats just weren't doing a very good job of winning it back. And I traveled all across the country and started off in Utah, and I have a good chapter in the book about going to Utah, the reddest place in the country, and what I found there, which was not entirely red. I found the extraordinary mayor, Rocky Anderson. You probably have heard of Rocky Anderson, the mayor of Salt Lake. A wild guy that when the president comes to town, he greeted him not with a motorcade and a fancy dinner at town hall, but rather with a massive demonstration against the war. And when the email that got out that he had sent to activists urging them to show up and show the president the biggest demonstration he'd ever seen in Utah, he didn't disown that email. He in fact went to the press and he said, of course I'm urging people to protest this president. It's my responsibility to keep my constituents and the people of Salt Lake City safe, and this guy and his policies pose the biggest threat we face. This is a great guy who also signed his city up to abide by the Kyoto protocols and is meeting them years ahead of schedule, even though DC hasn't yet signed on to that law. I also met progressives in Utah. There's something called the Utah Progressive Network, and they said we're like some hidden species that nobody knows exists. And I met a woman who lives with her father, who's a strong Mormon, and who is a lesbian with a partner who's having a child, and they all live in the same house. And she said, you know, my friends back in California can't even believe I live this way, but it's true. And they tell me that I must have no one to speak to in Utah. And she said, well, that's ridiculous. Of course I have to speak to everybody. And we have to speak to everybody in Utah, because if we only spoke to the people that agree with us, we'd be very lonely folks indeed. So she told a story about the anti-gay marriage initiative that passed in Utah and how people organized in Utah against it. And there was yard signs that opposed the initiative. And she talked about her decision about whether or not to put up one of these yard signs in the garden outside her house her father was okay with it, but they were worried what the neighbors would say. And she said, well, but you know what? If we're progressives, our job is to communicate with people who disagree with us. If we're progressives, we can't only, and this has lessons for the Democratic Party, we can't only campaign in the places that are progressive. We have to campaign everywhere because it's our job to function as a bridge. So she talked about, they put up the sign and she had conversations with the neighbors, and then on election day, she and her partner and the baby in a carriage and her father's girlfriend who lives 2 houses down, another Mormon. I guess you're allowed to have girlfriends. We don't know what activities they engage in, but they're upstanding Mormons. They all go to temple every week. Her father and his girlfriend, what is the right word for a girlfriend when you're 80? Woman friend. Yeah, companion. You would know. Right, sorry. Her father and his significant other, they all walked off to the voting booth together because that was their habit. They would go off to church together and they would go to do activities together, and they all walked off to go to the voting booth together, the precinct place, polling station. And along the way, the significant other, whose name was Mary, asked my friend, whose name is Gina, about this sign on her yard. And she said, well, I know that you love me and my partner, and you will send your yard man over to help us when there's a storm and there are trees over our lines, and you'll never deny us in a time of need, and you've looked after my father very well, and we're sort of extended family. And I know you would never intentionally do anything to hurt me or my partner, but maybe you don't understand that this resolution would actually hurt us. It would hurt our ability to function as equal people in this society. It hurts our kids standing in school. It hurts our access to health care. It kind of permits a form of discrimination that affects me in my life. Maybe a lot of people in our community don't understand how this stuff hurts people they actually care about and that are part of the community. And Mormons are very big on community and breeding very, very many children. So she had this conversation, and Mary nodded. And Gina thought, well, what the hell, that's what the sign is about, and whatever, our relationships exist no matter what happens. And on the way back after they had all voted, Gina and Mary and her husband, her friend and Gina's partner and the baby are all walking home. And Mary calls Gina over and whispers in her ear, she said, I voted against that thing. And thank you for telling me about it. And the lesson I got from Utah is the lesson I got from Gina, which is where she said, it's ridiculous for the Democratic Party only to be campaigning in the places they think they can win. It's ridiculous for a campaign to write off 1/3 of all the states, because if you don't campaign in a place, how can you possibly change minds there? If you don't talk to people who disagree with you, how can you build a movement? She said, if we want to form a bridge, we want to be a bridge, we have to go near the water. And that was the lesson I brought from Utah. So then after I went to Utah, I went to places like Montana, and I just came back from Montana this week. Election night on the East Coast, we heard about Montana, and we heard about Brian Schweitzer, the governor, right? And what did we hear about Brian Schweitzer, the governor? We heard about Brian Schweitzer wearing cowboy boots and a bolo tie. And really, you got the impression that for a Democrat to win in the West, that's what's required. You have to wear cowboy boots and a bolo tie, and it helps if you can wrestle a calf, but that's about it. So I had visions of all these candidates showing up in their cowboy boots and their bolo tie, hoping that they would win the West. It's a little more complex than that. I also heard about something called the Montana Miracle. How amazing! They elected this guy after 16 years, courtesy of his cowboy boots and his bolo tie. And they flipped the state house, both chambers. How amazing is that? It must have been a miracle. Now, I think we women are always a little skeptical of this idea of a miracle. It's sort of like the miracle of motherhood. It usually ignores the miserable 9 months and just focuses on the baby boy, right? So I thought, miracle, I bet. Went to Montana and found out that it wasn't so much to do with the cowboy boots and the bolo tie or the miracle or even the wrestling of the calf, although that probably can't hurt. What had happened in Montana was the result of 10 years of work. And that's the problem, isn't it, with our campaign coverage? The media love to cover campaigns, but they really only cover candidates. They look at the top of the ticket, and they don't look at all the work that happens on beneath. And part of the project of this book is to reverse the tendency of mainstream media campaign coverage, which makes everything into a horse race and makes it look as if the only important players are those horses running around the track. And instead refocus back on the people in the stands. What are you and we, the people, doing that makes a difference? Because if we only look at the candidate, what role is there for all of us? If we only look at the candidate, we're constantly waiting for the Messiah to come, instead of realizing there's a job for each one of us to make change where we live. Not once every 4 years, not only where people agree with us, but everywhere and all the time. And in Montana, I got exactly that story. I was there in 2006. It was beginning of a midterm election year. I mean, in New York, nobody was thinking about the midterm election vote. But in Montana, at a Women's Day potluck luncheon, there were already voter registration forms everywhere. They were doing workshops recruiting their local members to run for office. They were having leadership trainings for state officials and for the leaders of local campaign organizations to help them do their work better. And there was even some workshops going on for people interested in doing independent media work. And I was very impressed, and I came away realizing that, wow, Brian Schweitzer was a great candidate. But the campaign in that state had been going on for 10 years. A lot of people who had realized earlier than we did nationally, in 1992 in Montana and 1994, their state houses had flipped and the conservatives had taken over, and they realized the kind of politics we're used to doing, protesting on the Capitol Hill steps, won't work if there's nobody inside the Capitol who gives a fig about what we have to say. If we don't have people like us or who understand us elected to local office, there's no point our protesting because nobody wants to hear what we're complaining about. So instead of waiting for a candidate, they were training candidates. And I met a woman called Mary Cafaro, who heads an anti-poverty women's organization, who's a former welfare recipient and who lives in Helena, Montana. And she doesn't have cowboy boots and a bolo tie, but she does have very beautiful long black hair and a big dog. Brian Schweitzer has a big dog he's very famous for. And she, about 6 years ago now, decided to run for office. And everybody said, oh, you've got to be crazy. Former welfare recipient, you've got 4 kids under 19. How do you think you're ever going to run for office? And she said, I'm a mom. I'm a poor mom. We're the experts when it comes to multitasking. I can do this. And I have a community I've built up. There are people that trust me because of the work I've done over the years. And my community, poor women, particularly poor single moms, are one of the Democrats' least well-mobilized constituencies. And maybe it's because they never see anybody like themselves running for office. So I believe that if I can show my voters that I can get elected, they can get it, that this process has something in it for them. Because the radical right in Montana, and don't forget Montana is the state of the white militia movement, the white supremacists, the militia Montana and all, they have thrived by saying government is the enemy. Government is the enemy of the people. We're against government. There's nothing in it for you. And they've tapped into a feeling that exists amongst a lot of people, right and left, that there is nothing to be gained from government and that they'd be better off writing the whole thing off. Mary said if we're going to combat that, we have to show people like us engaged in government and making change that helps people where they live and in the areas that they care about. So she ran with 4 kids under 19. I think she press ganged them into carrying her picket signs and handing out her flyers. So she had a little campaign team just inside her house. Her friends and family and neighbors looked after the kids and went leafleting for her. She walked her blocks, as they call it, went from door to door talking to her neighbors every day pretty much for a year before the vote. She was in a primary race against a lot of establishment Democrats who were sure they were going to win, all guys, none of them former welfare recipients. And she beat them, hands down, 45, 65%, something like that. 45, 55, I guess that would be. She then went on to win the general election, and she's now a state senator, where she was critical in passing in Montana a raise the minimum wage bill and expanding health care to thousands of poor Montanan kids. Mary Cafaro is a great lesson, I think, for the Democrats, that we need to change the candidates that we're running, and we need to have candidates that will really speak to the issues that people care about. So I went from Montana to Nevada, all sorts of places. Nevada was an interesting place where I found out what had changed or what needed to change within the Democratic Party itself. We've talked a little bit about the message. We've talked a little bit about the messenger. There is the question of the machine. And when we all kind of remember how frustrating 2004 was, I think we're getting to the heart of what has been a huge problem for the Democratic Party, which has been the decline of state parties and the decline of the party infrastructure, such that a third of all states never receive a visit from a campaign. More than half the states in 2004, when they were surveyed after the election, had no full-time staff. 67% had no communications director. Nobody like Karen Hughes working in the Texas Republican Party, hammering Ann Richards day in, day out. Just no communications director at all. So how do you get your message out in between elections? More than half of all of the state parties had no functioning website. It was really as if there was a whole mountain of people on a hill saying, hello, we're Democrats. We would vote for you if only you asked us to, if only you cared about where we live. And the Democrats were just looking somewhere else. Even in Nevada, when I went to Nevada 2006, now Nevada is the home state of the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, powerful guy. It's been a battleground state for the last 2 presidential elections, and it will be again in 2008. Nevada had seen massive turnout, but the people that had campaigned to turn out the vote in 2004 weren't, for the most part, people who were connected to the Democratic Party. They were people coming in from California with ACT and Move On and all those good 527 groups. And while that was great, it was problematic in the streets of Las Vegas. Because in the community of Las Vegas, who have you got? You've got a huge proportion of immigrant workers who are scared to death of strangers walking down their block. Because half of those strangers are from the immigration authorities, and they want to evict and deport the undocumented people who are living in their midst, waiting to get legal. Now, you can't send a teenager from Berkeley to walk the blocks of Las Vegas and expect to have a good result. So I went to Nevada and I said, well, how come you don't have enough Democrats to do this work? Well, because we haven't ever collected the lists of volunteers in election time. And besides, the population of Nevada doubles every 10 years. We can't possibly keep track. The Democratic Party never collected the lists of the volunteers, the people who would volunteer in election 2000 or 2002 or 2004. Those lists got old, they've shriveled up and blew away. When you went and did voter turnout work for the Democrats, even in 2004, and you got new data on the streets about what people thought or where they lived or how many people were living in the house, that data wasn't entered into an online database. It was written in pencil into a big fat ledger book that then was put on a shelf until the next election 4 years later when the population had changed. Meanwhile, Republicans were walking down the street with little Palm Pilot personal computers where they were able to enter the information. It went to an online site, and everything was updated, and you could access those lists from anywhere in the state. So I wasn't wrong that the Democrats weren't really doing their half of the job. They weren't keeping clean their half of the street. And I think that there have been some lessons learned since I wrote this book. At the level of machinery, you've got Howard Dean's 50-state project. He did the same sort of double take that I did after election 04. What do you mean people can't get yard signs? What do you mean the lists are on big paper sheets that are put on the shelf for 4 years in between votes? And he decided we need to have a campaign to reinvigorate the state party in every state, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Alaska, not just the battleground places. And he got into a lot of trouble for it in 2006, as you remember, when Rahm Emanuel and the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee were pissed off that Dean wasn't just putting all of the DNC's money into running behind candidates, but instead was trying to build up these state parties in states like Mississippi. And what's the point of that? Well, the point of that was when I went to Mississippi, I found a guy working in the office for the first time. They had been able to hire 4 full-time workers, and those workers were able to actually do useful things like answer the phones. And I met a guy who said, I'm volunteering for the Democratic Party, and I'm so happy because I called 15 years to volunteer and nobody called me back. That makes a difference. The other thing they're doing is realizing that with national television, what happened to the state parties was that in the 1970s, well, in the 1960s and 70s, the Democrats faced a rebellion in their ranks, as we all remember, and decided to insert more control from the top to try to keep the bottom, more obedient. The other thing they did was they realized that they could circumvent some of the old party bosses who were not so great. Corruption was rampant. By communicating directly through national television with the voters. You didn't need to go through the state parties if you could advertise through national TV direct to voters, and that's exactly what they did. Television's expensive. We don't have publicly financed elections, which we need, don't we? So you have to raise an awful lot of money to pay for all those TV ads, and I think it's a big reason why John Edwards was given so little media attention, was because he was calling for public financing, which would have taken billions of dollars out of the coffers of the very media who were deciding whether to give him coverage or not. But if you're going to pay for TV ads, you need to raise a lot of money, and we saw a party that I say turned into a penthouse party. All the power and the money and the decision-making at the top, advertising, communicating with voters through national TV. Penthouse party, all power at the top, all power in the suites, and really no staircase down to the streets. So that you would have states like Mississippi, Utah, Montana even, where they hadn't heard from a national Democrat in years. That's changed. Howard Dean is realizing you can't rely on national television. We need field troops, just like the right has used Christian churches. We need people on the ground, foot soldiers, to do the work. And that's a lot of what my book is about talking to those foot soldiers, what their experience is, what works, what doesn't work. The final piece of the picture, and then I'll close, I think, is about what those foot soldiers bring in terms of message. What actually is going to change in terms of giving people something to vote for. Because I think we've seen some changes at the level of the machinery, more focus on the field operations, less focus simply on national television, more focus on state parties in all the 50 states. We've seen some change at the level of candidates. In 2006, we saw groups like ours, grassroots organizations, circumvent the national Democrats and run some pretty progressive candidates for office. And we saw some extraordinary victories. These people who, like Carol Shea Porter of New Hampshire. Anyone here from New Hampshire? Nobody from New Hampshire. Okay, well, Carol Shea Porter was an anti-war candidate in the district, in the 2nd or 1st district of New Hampshire, who ran for a seat that hadn't been held by a Democrat in years. And she was told by Rahm Emanuel of the DCCC that her district wasn't competitive. And then he said, and even if it was competitive, you shouldn't run in it. And even if it was competitive and you ran in it, you definitely should not run on the issue of the war. Because this is a woman who had made the war her issue. She'd been dragged out of a Bush party fundraiser wearing a Arrest Bush t-shirt. Rahm Emanuel said, no, 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 this is not the kind of person we think can win in New Hampshire, of all places. And she said, well, thank you very much for your advice. I would have liked your campaign support and your money. But I believe it is competitive. I believe I can win it, and I believe I can win it on the war. And that's exactly what she did. She pulled together a kitchen table cabinet of peace-knit grandmothers, and she won that district, and she was sent to Washington. And she wasn't the only one. There were a slew of candidates, John Hall in New York and others, who were elected against all the odds because of new talent at the level of their campaigners and new tools. We could find ways to raise money and communicate with each other on the internet that we had never had before. It's kind of like the right figured out in the 1970s how to use direct mail to raise money and communicate with people in a new way. Well, I think in the 1990s and 2000s, we figured out how to do it using the internet. But what we found out since in 2007 is it's not enough to just have a few progressive Democrats in Congress, right? 13 months after a Democratic majority was elected, we have more troops in Iraq, more money going to Iraq, more levees breaking around more cities than we had before. And today it's not only the people of New Orleans who are losing their homes. We've got big troubles. And all those people, think of what happened to Carol Shea Porter before I talk about all those people. Carol Shea Porter, first thing that happened to her when she got to Washington, and she wasn't the only one, she gets elected on this anti-war platform. She gets to start her office in Washington, and she's putting her pencil in the Washington congressional members' cup, and she's figuring out where the bathrooms are, and the bathrooms for women in the Capitol are somewhere on another block, I think. And she, is getting her foothold, figuring out how to work in Washington. Almost the first thing that happens is she's invited to go on a high top security secret delegation to Iraq. And she's taken on a congressional delegation to Iraq, and she goes to the Green Zone. And she meets the soldiers, and she meets the troops, and she's introduced to the New Hampshire National Guard who are there. And she comes back, and that must have been a pretty heady experience. And she comes back, and Carol Shea Porter, never been in Washington before as a congresswoman, almost the first thing she has to do is vote on an appropriation bill for the war in Iraq. So what does she do? She votes for the appropriation for Iraq. Now, she's a good person, and she's stood up strongly against, she's stood up for timetables, and she's done what she could do. But her experience highlights the problem. You can't just change a few people. You have to change the priorities of the party, the priorities and power in Washington. Because all those people who were standing on the hill over here saying, we're here, we'll work for you if you give us a chance and a reason. It reminded me of a poem by Stevie Smith, who wrote a poem about a woman who seemed to be a big optimist, kind of like me, but actually wasn't, was sort of suicidal actually instead. I'm not. And there's a line in the poem where she says, this woman was much too far out all her life and wasn't waving but drowning. And all those people who have been out there waving, we're here, we want to change Washington, I would say are not just waving, they're drowning. They need change in their lives. They need change in the level of priorities in this country. They don't just need a change of power or party in Washington. They need power used in a new way. I see in the mobilization around the general election some movement building that I think could speak to the desire people have here, not just to elect new candidates, but to build movement that could hold all candidates accountable. Because really, in the end, that's what we need. We need a movement like the civil rights movement. We need a movement like the women's movement, the environmental movement, the peace movement, that made it impossible for a president not to sign the Civil Rights Act. Impossible for Richard Nixon not to sign the Environmental Protection Act. It wasn't like the corporations were any happier with environmental laws in 1972 than they are today. But it was an irrepressible force demanding that Nixon sign that, and it would have been impossible for him not to. That's where we've got to get to today. It's not okay that we have a vast majority in this country who oppose this war, want to bring the troops home, want to end the occupation of Iraq. We have not made it impossible for the Democrats in Congress to continue funding this war. And that burden is, I think, on us. Thanks a lot.
Okay, let's take some questions from the floor.
I think that what you've got in the contrast between Obama's campaign and Hillary is not at the level of policy. At the level of policy, they're almost identical, and neither one is what I would like. But at the level of style of leadership and style of organizing, they're very different. I'd say they're miles apart. And I've followed both of the campaigns. I wrote a chapter for a book called The Contenders, about the Democratic contenders. My chapter was about Hillary. I followed her campaign a little bit in the summer of last year, and I've been following the Obama campaign a little bit since. I was just in Colorado, Montana. I've seen it in various places. And what is different is that Hillary provides and offers a type of leadership that is the traditional style of leadership. She says, I am qualified, I have the credentials, I can do this for you. Obama says, I'm a community organizer, I have a history of community organizing, I'll take my leadership from you. And I think that appeals to a lot of different people in different ways. There are some who do just want the ironclad leader to come in and do battle in Washington and win on our behalf. And then there are a lot of people, I think young people, and I think a lot of the people I write about in the book, who've been wanting to be engaged in a process, who want to be part of something that wants them to play a part. And the Obama campaign, from its very beginning, because Obama is a community organizer, and that means taking leadership from the community, has sent that message to his supporters: I can only win this with your help, and you also need to make change and be part of making change. It's both a more challenging demand, I need you to do something, and it's also a more satisfying engagement for the people that take part in it. I spoke to a lot of people who'd been volunteering for Hillary for many weeks in the state of New Hampshire. And they said it's great. Her campaign is very disciplined. It's very on target. It has money. She had more paid people in New Hampshire than all of the other candidates put together as early as last June. But there isn't much room for initiative here. I'm not sure people really know my name. I believe in Hillary, but it really is about Hillary. On the other hand, in Colorado, I met young people who had signed up on the website of Obama in February of 2007, right after he announced. And within 24 hours, having signed up on the website in a little steel town called Pueblo, Colorado. Somebody from Pueblo. Not, you wouldn't think you're Obama headquarters, right? A little steel town called Pueblo, a woman had signed up and within 24 hours received a call back from somebody in the Barack Obama headquarters, and she'd been able through the website to print out his position sheets on the issues and to establish her own little website on the mybarackobama.com site where she could announce that she was starting a Pueblo for Obama group, and when she held her first meeting, 25 people showed up. When they opened an office for Obama in Colorado Springs, 2 days after the Iowa caucuses, before any paid staff were in Colorado Springs, when they opened an office, they had done enough work, the people there. This is the home of Focus on the Family and NORAD and the U.S. Air Force Academy, not a very progressive place. But local people had done enough work for Obama that 300 people showed up in Colorado Springs for the opening of the office. And somebody said to me, I said, well, but what is it? What do you want Obama to do? What do you think he'll do? And he kind of thought for a while, and finally he said, you know, it's not the message. He said, I like the message, but it's the method that I love. It's the way he's doing this campaign. And it goes back to the history of these two people. And I think there's something to be said for either one. They both studied Saul Alinsky, right? The community organizer in Illinois and Chicago. Hillary, when she was at college, wrote a college paper that has been forever sealed about studying the community organizing model of Saul Alinsky. And her conclusion that she writes about in her autobiography was that while community organizing was great, it had its limits, and she felt like real change happened inside government rather than outside. And that was the decision she made. She was still a Republican at that time, but she was looking for ways to make change. And that was the decision she made, that she was going to be the best possible leader of the people, best qualified, best trained, best experienced, and do that work from the top down. He, many years later, Barack Obama, graduated college, Harvard Law School, went to work in a community organization headed up by people who'd been trained by Alinsky, but Alinsky at this point was dead, because that's how he wanted to do his work. And that's a very different model. And I think apart from anything else, that's what people are voting for this election, this primary. And I think that's why Move On is an attractive organization to people who want to do their bit, is reflecting its members' choices when they vote for Obama. That's without even getting into questions of the war and all the rest of it. I think it's about the method. So that's my answer to that. And I think at the local level we need to build up a Green Party to make the changes at the state level to permit third-party candidates to have a chance, and for that to filter up like public financing of elections that's filtering up from the city level to the state level. Ultimately, I hope it will hit the federal government. So absolutely, we need a Green Party, and we need everybody else to be talking about the issues, and that's one of the reasons I'm sorry that Richardson has left the race, because he was the only one talking about no residual troops in Iraq. I'm sorry that Kucinich was iced out because he was the only one that talked about the word impeach. And I don't hear it coming from any of the others. Is McCain going to be forced to be the one that talks about torture? I mean, that would be a crying shame if he was the one who was getting any credit for opposing torture in the name of the United States defense. It's horrendous that we have two candidates that don't talk about habeas corpus, torture, the international ban on torture, don't talk about international law at all, and haven't yet written off an attack on Iran or the use of nukes. So, I'm not happy with either of these candidates, don't get me wrong. I have a glimmer of excitement about the movement behind Obama. And if that gives me reason to vote, then good. I told you I was an optimist. But, we have a president with a rap sheet behind him that is longer than my arm and nobody talking about it. And at what point does our Congress have to respond to a White House that breaks the law in daylight, refusing to come and testify when the Congress calls them, signing statements that just takes the president out of, says that is basically the president's message to us that he won't obey the law, and now he's doing it in public, we know about it. We have people who have given testimony to being tortured in states that the government sent, this government sent those detainees to. And we have an attorney general that can't say that he believes waterboarding is wrong. So again, it goes, I think we can rail all we like at the Democrats, but we do have a political system that requires us to organize to either change the system, to change the politics, or change the politics without changing the system. Take your pick. But the burden does come back on us. Otherwise, we're just, if we spend all our time just complaining about politicians who are supposedly working for us, who's the fool in that picture? Yeah. The question was, if most policy in America today, we have reason to believe that most policy is driven by, military adventurism, the war and occupation of Iraq, and militarism towards Iran, then isn't there a difference between Hillary, who did vote for this war in Iraq, and Obama, who didn't and spoke out against it? Now, he wasn't in the Senate at the time, but he spoke out against it as a state senator in Chicago. The problem is, I think that you're right. And again, we have two candidates who voted to fund the war on more than one occasion, who have said that no thing is off the table with respect to Iran, that means nukes, who have not recast the attacks of 9/11 as anything other than an act of war, when I'm longing for someone to say this was a criminal act that needed response through the criminal justice system, and who have not spoken out as loudly as I would like around the U.S. commitment to international law. No first strike wars, no wars against people that haven't attacked you, and obeying anti-terror anti-torture regulations and all the rest. We don't have the candidates we would like. Is there a difference between the two? Given the fact that Obama has now said that he is running on his speech against the war, whether or not he actually would have given that speech if he was in the Senate in 2004, we don't know, but he is running on that, so at least we can call him to account for that. I worry that Hillary's instincts, her gut instincts, are such that in 2001, right after the attacks of 9/11, she came out of the gate the next day and gave a speech calling the attacks an act of war. This was a time when Mary Robinson, who was the head of the UN Human Rights Commission, was saying it was a criminal act and needed to have a criminal response through international criminal law. Hillary went out of the gate saying it was an act of war, and that the power of the United States needed to be brought down on anybody not only who was responsible but had harbored anybody that was responsible. She basically gave the speech that George Bush gave 10 days later in the National Cathedral. I think he was taking notes. She also called for the bombing of Bosnia, of Yugoslavia, called Bill Clinton when he was considering whether or not, and the Pentagon was debating whether or not to bomb Milosevic's forces in Yugoslavia. And the Pentagon, in fact, was saying, don't bomb, send in ground troops, because if you bomb, there'll be more ethnic cleansing and more genocide on the ground. And Hillary said, she writes in her autobiography, I'm not making this up, she writes that she made a special phone call from Africa. She was on a trip with Chelsea to Africa. And she called the White House and spoke to Bill and said, bite the bullet, you've got to bomb. That's her instinct. Now, she had reasons for it, but I think we should be clear that she is not overcompensating, I don't think, being pro-military. I think that's actually who she is. In 1968, she didn't, she wanted the middle road candidate. If she could, she said she would have voted for Humphrey. It's a difference. At least Obama has, we can call Obama's bluff, it seems to me, or at least we can try. Yeah, there. Yeah, you.
I don't know what's happened to journalism, but I marched against the Vietnam War for almost 10 years, and I didn't miss a march, and there was always journalists on the trains and on the buses and everywhere, and everything was public, and you saw it on television, and everybody saw me on television. And
did everybody see her on television? The question is, how would you characterize journalism today when it comes to demonstrations and protests?
Zero.
So the question was, what's happened to journalism for 10 years during the anti-war movement, during the war in Vietnam? Our friend here protested. The journalists were always there, and they always caught her on camera, and I'm sure they were right to do that. Where are the journalists today? They simply don't cover the demonstrations. Well, I think they learned. If you don't cover them, they don't exist. Very clever. And again, I think that we have to support our independent media that do cover demonstrations, and we have to flood the media with complaint when they don't. People may remember the big, I think it was the February 15th march in 2003, where we had 15 million people around the world and 1 million people in the streets of New York. The New York Times did not cover that demonstration except to say that fewer than expected showed up. But 3 days later, they were forced to run another story because they had received so much grief. And all I can say is that I think that we've had a journalistic core come up during the years of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, being taught that if you go to demonstrations, maybe you yourself are a little suspect. That if you want to cover demonstrations, maybe you are a lefty journalist. And the right spent most of the second part of the 70s and all of the 80s and 90s saying that journalists were lefties. And a lot of the journalists not only came to believe it themselves, but we had a contraction of the media industry so that jobs were scarce. I can't get a job in mainstream media. Maybe I could have in 1976. We had, in once upon a time, you could work for the paper at one end of town, and if they didn't agree with you or kicked you out, you could go work for the paper at the other end of town, whose views and whose ownership was different. We don't have that today. Today, there's one paper owned by one person. Journalists, as the National Journalists Union says, work in chains. So I think they're scared. We've had an institutional change that intimidates journalists, and we've had an ideological change, courtesy of the right's think tanks, that intimidates journalists as well. So I don't think it's a surprise that they can get away with not covering protests, but it is a surprise that so many of us sit back and take it. Behind you had a question. But you had a question, right?
I suppose this would make a lot of sense to a lot of the people here. I like to call the McCarthy era the Great American Purge. I think we are still suffering today the effects of that, not having had journalists, writers, professors in the school for several generations. I want to know what you think about it. Is it still with us?
You would say, what about the ramifications of the 50s era? Aren't we as a country still suffering from the McCarthy years in a way that, people often say to me, how come there's still a left in Europe and there isn't one here? I think that that's a big part of it, that I think people are scared, and they're particularly scared to have anything that sounds like a left-wing agenda. You can have a critique of the right. But if you have your own alternative proposal, I think that that is cast as being a communist. To this day, that hurts, and to this day, that matters. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think it's real. I've sat, the very first time I was ever on the only time I was on the, what is it called, Hannity and Colmes. Colmes gave me a nice sappy introduction. I worked for FAIR at the time, the Media Watch group. Hannity's first question to me live on the air was, so, are you a communist? That was 1999.
Only yesterday.
I said, is that a loyalty oath? You know, but you're already screwed. Yeah.
One of the big elephants in the room that nobody's talking about, we talked about some of the media that's not representative, but you go places like NBC and NBC, they're sponsored by GE and the rest of them. That's the war machine. When Eisenhower made that statement, that farewell address about the military-industrial complex, he left out one piece of it. And he left that out because of pressure. The piece that he left out was the military-industrial congressional complex. And we're still being haunted by that situation today. And that's what we got to deal with. Once we deal with that, we got plenty of money to do the things we have to do in this country. Any comments on that?
No, I think you made a very good point. I mean, it's true. And Naomi Klein, who writes the new introduction to the paperback copy of my book, says, you know, NBC is also now in the business, or GE is now in the business of making homeland security devices. And when you go through those bomb detection units at the airport, you'll see it says GE on the side. So what a nice little synchronicity of interest. I always say it's not about conflict of interest, it's about congruence of interest. That they both play the role of scaring us in the nightly news and then defending us and making a profit. There's no question we have a problem. And this very week, we saw a giveaway to the big media businesses that was kind of submerged underneath our election coverage. We're losing, no question, we are losing our independent media, and we have to fight to keep it back. Now, I think that there is some hope with the internet providing ways for you all, for example, to hear my radio show, whether your radio station carries it or not. And that is going to improve as people can get little units that will play satellite radio and radio off the internet in the same way that we now play radios coming from us from a radio station. I think there are some clearly new means of communication. Otherwise, we would never have a candidate called Barack Obama running for office. It just wouldn't happen. And he wouldn't be able to raise money for his support. He raised $32 million in small donations in the last month. That's new. So I think there are ways to run around the media monopoly that haunts us, but in terms of breaking that monopoly down, until we have a president that goes back to some of the antitrust laws that do exist in this country, thanks to the left of the first part of the century, and Republicans actually from the first part of the century, we're not going to get our mainstream media back. But we are, I think, the mainstream, and we just have to remember that we need to make and support our own media. Too. Thanks so much. I think we should probably call it quits. Right?
Yes, I think we have to call it quits. Thank you, Laura. It was a terrific meeting. And one thing, Laura, no 10 years. We want you back a lot sooner.
Get into attacking the media, but really we could all do that, and we all do that all the time. So let me start on the positive stuff. The book really had its birth on election night 2004. I don't know how many of you are Air America listeners or listen to, is it Jack? Uncle Jack? Uncle Jack's niece, Randy Rhodes, on Air America. Yes. So Air America's audience is a very hard-working, hard-hoping, progressive, liberal, democratic audience, right? There's probably no audience out there that more accurately reflected the hopes and dreams of Democratic voters in 2004. And we launched in March of 2004 with great expectations, not enough money, but great expectations. And we were on the air throughout that very exciting election year. And I was, the great thing about call-in radio is you get to hear what your audience are doing, because they call in and tell you. And I heard what people are doing, and they were probably doing what you were doing, which was a whole lot more than they had done for elections any time recently. People were not only giving money and not only giving names from...
It's indeed a pleasure to welcome back Laura to our forum. She was here in 98 and 99, and it's been a long time, but it's wonderful to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back. So I'm actually here to tell good news, I think. I don't know about your other speakers, but often people on the left have a pretty grim picture of the world. I maintain a dogged commitment to optimism. And this book is really, I say at the beginning, it's a book of good news for grim times. It's not a feel-good book, it's a wise-up book, and it's really a message to all of those people who would tell the Democratic Party to move further to the center and talk more about God and kind of hush those pesky voices at the margins that keep talking about social justice and peace. It's really a book about how progressives can win in this country, and in fact are winning all around the country at the local level, sometimes the state level, and how there are lessons that could be learned by the national Democratic leadership from the people at the base, if only they felt inclined to learn. So that's the nature of the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about where it comes from. And along the way, I'm sure on their phone books, they were also knocking on doors in their neighborhoods. They were calling complete strangers out of the blue to ask if they were going to vote. They were even, some of them, traveling to other states and knocking on strangers' doors and asking if they would vote. How many of you did stuff you hadn't done before in 2004, or know people that really got off their butts and did amazing work in that year, right? So more people we know turned out for that election, and maybe they weren't turning out for Kerry Edwards as much as they were turning out to get rid of Bush and Cheney. But they were turning out, they were doing this work. They broke my hearts with their excitement. And along the way, I got calls from people saying things like, can you get me a Kerry Edwards yard sign? And I thought, well, I'm in New York. I don't even have a yard, let alone a yard sign. Why the heck are you calling me? I said, why don't you go to the Kerry Edwards website? I'm sure you can download a little sign and hammer it on a piece of wood. So I said this for many weeks until some smart-ass caller called in and said, there is no way to download a sign on the Kerry Edwards website. And then I did what you should never do on talk radio, which was to say, oh, I'm sure there is. And I turned on the computer and I brought up the site, and then you had minutes of dead air while I was going, huh? Because there was almost nothing you could do on the Kerry Edwards website except for sign up to receive pitch letters asking you for money. So that rang a little bell in my head. I was worried. And people said, you know, we can't get anyone to call us back from the Kerry Edwards campaign. We can't get our local Democratic Party office to have office hours. Nobody will contact us when we contact them. There isn't even an office that's open where we live, and the candidates don't come to our state during election year. So I'm thinking about all this, and then election night happens, right? Now, this was supposed to be a cheery day for Democrats, and all day it seemed like it was going to be a cheery day, right? The polls were saying that Kerry Edwards were going to win. I had a whole show prepared that was about how it was all very well for Kerry Edwards to win, but the real work was going to begin when they took office. And as I walked to work, and I live in downtown Manhattan, and although Air America has moved several times, having to do something with not paying bills, we now are at an undisclosed location with Dick Cheney. No. The office on Election Day was in Midtown on 34th Street, and it caused me to walk uptown past Union Square. So I was walking uptown, and I'm sort of addicted to the radio, so I had an earplug in my ear, and I was listening to Al Franken, who for some reason got the cocktail hour shift, and he was reporting live from Kerry Edwards' headquarters in Boston with, I think, a martini in one hand and, you know, the microphone in the other, sounding very happy. And as I walked past Union Square, I thought of, well, not only Emma Goldman and all the history of Union Square, but I thought of the massive demonstrations that had taken place during the Republican National Convention that took place there in Union Square. And I remembered in particular the huge demonstration that took place on the closing night of the Republican National Convention, when, as some of you may remember, the whole of Penn Station, that area where Madison Square Garden is, and where the convention had been taking place had been completely shut down thanks to Bloomberg. And let's not forget that Michael Bloomberg basically gave our city over to the Republicans, much as he claims to be an independent. The last night of the convention,